I'm going to show you how to make this intricate inlaid box. The inlay wraps around all four corners of the box, so it matches all the way around. You can keep turning the box around and around. You'll never find the end of the inlay because it has no end, it's infinite. Also, the grain wraps all the way around the box, all four corners, so it matches up and has this nice flow of the grain through all four corners. So I will show you how to do that. I use the Shaper Origin CNC router to do it. You could do it with any other CNC. I think it would work just as well with a regular gantry CNC. So I'll show you the techniques. I'll show you a couple of pitfalls, a couple of mistakes I made along the way, but a nice successful project. I'm about to wrap it up so I can give it to my mom for her 95th birthday. All right, before you can cut this project, you've got to design it, obviously. So this starts with laying out the box sides in whatever design program you use. I happen to use Affinity Designer too. And I'm not going to go into all the details on the design, but if you're interested in that, I've got a very detailed project up on Shaper Hub. That's a community site for sharing projects put out by the Shaper Origin CNC router people. That's got a huge amount of detail on how to do this design. But I'm just going to go through the bare basics here so you can get an idea of what's going on. There is a link, by the way, to that project in the description. So anyways, I lay out the box sides here in the order that they'll go together. So long side, short side, long side, short side. And what'll happen is, obviously, when the box is folded together, this side D is going to hook up over here with this side A. So, first off, you just draw your part that's going to wrap around. This is the vine that kind of wraps around the whole box. And the critical part here is that you make sure that this little corner over here and this little corner over here line up so that when side D gets hooked up with side A, those pieces will match. So I've just drawn down a guide and you can see they line up. Same thing with the bottom of the inlay. So you just do that by moving things around until they just snap to a guide, and that way that'll all match. The rest of the design is, just other stuff that's sort of fuzzied on there, some twigs and some leaves and so on and so forth. And this leaf is going to go around a box side. It's going to actually wrap around a corner. And so I just had it here and then I copied it right over there. So it's sort of on that same line on both places. So it'll copy over when I cut this out. So look, this is how it's going to look in a final box, but this is not ready for cutting, because when you cut the box sides apart, you've got to leave room for a kerf. So what is that really going to look like? Well, here is kind of how it's going to look. Basically, there's going to be two different boards, one with A and B, the other one with C and D. And what I've done here is a couple of things. I've added some room for waste at the end of each board. These spots, one on each end of each board. And then I have actually added the saw blade kerfs in there. And if you look, I'll zoom in and you can kind of see it a little bit better. If you look at where a saw blade kerf is going to hit, I've actually added some, some extra room to the inlay itself, knowing that I have to go and cut that thing apart, and that's going to end up just being, sawdust. So that's basically how you do it. There's a lot more detail. I realize I'm not giving you enough here that you could, have any chance of following along with this. But if you look at that Shaper Hub project, I think you actually can follow along with it if you want to make your own design. I made the box so the grain wraps around the box as well as the inlay wrapping around the box, just, because it looks really neat to have that sort of continuous grain wrap. I'm not going to get into how to do that on this video. There are some instructions for that in the PDF that I've got for this project. You don't have to use a grain wrap, of course. You could just make the box without the grain wrap and have the inlay wrap around. if you are going to do the grain wrap, I would just suggest you look for some other videos or just techniques on doing a grain wrap, and at least get to where you're comfortable doing a grain wrap box without the inlay first, because otherwise it's just too difficult to have both an inlay technique and a grain wrap technique going on at the same time if you're not familiar with both of those. Anyhow, so here I am resawing the board that I'm going to use. Resawing is a must if you're going to do a grain wrap box. I do the resaw on the table saw to start with, and then cut away that last little bit on the bandsaw. The next task is to cut the positive parts for the inlay. This is just a sheet of 1/8 inch wood, and I've just cut the positives. You can see that long vine for the inlay. By the way, these sheets are the same length essentially as the board that I'm going to be using. So that's basically side A and B right there. I've got a separate sheet for the inlays that go on side C and D. If you're familiar with doing an inlay on the shaper origin, the idea is that you cut your positive parts first, and then you can use your positive parts to make sure that the negative parts you'll be cutting, the negative inlay pockets, will actually fit. And to the extent that you need to adjust your inlay pockets, you can do that by using offsets and just actually test fitting as you go. I definitely suggest that you do some simpler inlay projects on your shaper origin or whatever your CNC is before you try to tackle this project. The project is set up so there are two boards to hold the four sides of the box. Each board has a long side and a short side, so I think this is A and B, maybe it's C and D, but whatever. And before I cut the actual box sides out, I get all of the inlay parts fit. I'm going to get them all glued in and then cut my four box sides out only after the inlay is totally complete. This shows one of my little mistakes. I had hoped to make the leaves green on this project. That ended up not working because the green stain I put on wood that's otherwise yellow just sanded off when I went to smooth out the box after putting in the inlay parts. So I ended up with kind of yellow leaves with a little bit of green staining around the edges. They don't look bad. It's not what I intended though. Here's what it looks like when the inlays have been glued in, but the box sides have not been cut out. If you look over on the left side of those boards, you can see there's some negative portions of the inlay that aren't filled in. And what'll happen is when I cut off the right side, kind of where my finger was just pointing, I'm going to move some little pieces, one piece of a leaf and one piece of a twig, over to fill out those spaces. So I've got to be very careful when I cut off the left-hand side of those pieces to make sure that the tiny little inlay pieces don't go flying. I could not glue those in. Everything else is already glued in though. Anytime you're making a box, you've got to make sure that the sides are cut to exactly the right dimensions. Here I'm cutting off a little bit of that right-hand side of the box, and I'm using some tape to make sure that I don't lose the little part that isn't glued in. I'm using a cross-cut sled, and I've got some stop blocks so I can get the exact right measurement on each piece. That using a stop block makes it very repeatable because I've got to make sure the second set of cuts I'm making are exactly the right size as well. You just really want to set this up and measure it carefully. You'll note that I'm not doing the bevels here. I'm doing straight cuts at first, and I'll add the bevels later. Got a little bit of damage when I cut the box sides apart. You'll see a spot that'll zoom in a second where some of the wood just chipped out. And I think what's going on there is I just didn't have any glue right in that spot, and so the wood was just really weak there, and it got torn apart in the table saw blade. I had a couple other spots that did the same thing, and I think the message there is to make sure you've got everything glued in really carefully and not any spots without glue. But I was able to fix it, just made a little splinter and stuck it in there. I cut the bevels using a different table saw sled. I guess the message here is you need to figure out how to make a mitered box before you try to take on this project, right? You don't want to put a bunch of effort into you making an intricate inlay and then discover that you don't have a good way of accurately making the miters so that your box goes together square. If I had to do it over again when I'm cutting out these miters, I would have gotten a piece of like scrap plywood or something and just held it over the entire face of the box as I made the cut. Without that, I got a little bit of kind of damage to the edges and a little bit of tear out, and I think that could have been avoided. From this point forward, this is just a conventional box. I just glued it together. I didn't use splines or any other reinforcements. It's plenty strong. It's not going to get handled roughly. And I just held it together while the glue dried with, tape and rubber bands and a band clamp. Finish, of course, is a personal preference. I used a couple of coats of shellac and then some stuff I really like on top of it, just a coat of Renaissance wax, and I really like that Renaissance wax stuff. You can see the box top over there in the picture. It's got the little thing sticking out of it. That's a shape that replicates the shape of the leaves going around on the inlay, and that's a box pull on the top of it. I made a little mortise with the shape or origin for that to fit into and get glued into. So hope you enjoyed the project. I welcome you to like and subscribe to my little unprofessional channel, and I look forward to seeing you again. Bye.